It was early Tuesday morning. Robert Fisher, who was the kind of guy that rarely missed his work shifts, had not only failed to show up for work, but had also omitted to inform anyone of his absence. This was highly uncharacteristic for someone like him, as he took work very seriously, was well respected, and was often the first to volunteer when it came to covering night shifts. So naturally, the total lack of communication had caught a couple of his co-workers off guard. Stranger still, this Toyota 4Runner, which belonged almost exclusively to his wife Mary, was also missing from the driveway. Her Tuesday routine entailed waking up early, taking the children to school, and visiting the church afterward. So given that her car wasn't there, it'd be reasonable to assume that she was out on one of these errands. However, this time, the familiar pattern didn't hold, as neither Mary nor her children made an appearance that morning. The phone at the Fishers' residence rang multiple times, but the family, for whatever reason, never cared to answer. Their house seemed to have drowned in silence, when suddenly, a thunderous explosion erupted from within.
Thank you for watching KPHO Television, Arizona 5 CBS.
Let me share with you a shocking statistic. Across North America, there are an estimated 800 fires daily.
Better than the rest. Let's go get the commie. Eddie. Cut. Full house exploding.
Okay, we do have police and fire on the way. Were there people inside the house?
Yes, there are. They're probably dead.
Okay, and do you know the,
Just back up.
do you know the,
Slow.
hey Dave?
And the guy's house next door is going to catch on fire, too.
Okay, I'm telling the officers right now that people are inside the house.
All right,
We don't
all
know.
right.
The aftermath was nothing short of devastating. The house burned down in minutes, and debris was scattered anywhere you looked at. Under the collapsed carport was Robert's pickup truck, the interior of which had entirely melted from the bottom all the way to the headliner. Most rooms felt like a scene from a post-apocalyptic nightmare, and the walls were so badly damaged that you could freely see from one side to the other. Though I'm not sure you'd want to, as it was in these rooms where the true horror of the situation began to unravel. Bobby, their 10-year-old child, was the first to be discovered. They found his body lying on a burnt-up mattress. He was the least damaged of all, but due to the extreme deterioration of his body, identifying him still posed a challenge, which speaks volumes about the magnitude of the explosion. In the next room, they found the 12-year-old Brittany. Similarly, she was also lying on her bed, horribly deformed and far beyond saving. The last victim, owing to their physical size, was thought to be an adult. This was later confirmed by a woman's wedding ring found on their hand, identifying the remains as Mary's. She was found in a comparable position to her children, which was a strong indication that none of them had even attempted to escape the burning house. Although this may seem odd at first, there would normally be a pretty straightforward explanation for it. The majority of fatal fire accidents happen in houses where a fire alarm is absent. As a result of that, the victims often tend to die in their sleep, without ever waking up to witness the fire surrounding them. However, when it comes to the Fisher family, things were a little more complex. It was revealed that the necks of all three victims had been cut. These wounds were unmistakably different from the ones caused by the fire, cutting deep from the front of their neck all the way to the cervical spine, almost entirely decapitating them. And to add insult to injury, Mary had also received a gun wound to the back of her head. Having mentioned that, it probably wouldn't come as a surprise if I told you that the explosion wasn't an accident. It happened because someone had purposefully disconnected the gas line from the furnace, Consequently, the natural gas slowly filled up the house before reaching an ignition source and setting the house ablaze. As police sifted through the wreckage, they also came across 2 candle holders, suggesting that the fire was likely started by a candle. Though, they also retrieved a makeshift device made of a battery attached to wire and tinfoil, which could have been used to spark a fire as well. All of this to say, one thing was for certain. The family had been dead long before the explosion. As I've been talking about the victims, you may have noticed that I only mentioned 3 of them so far, and that's because there was no 4th, or 5th for that matter. The 5th being Bloom, the family dog, who, along with Robert, had both gone missing. Police scoured the entirety of the scene, attempting to locate Robert's remains, but they didn't find much. So logically, they were left with only 2 possible conclusions. Either Robert was away from home when the explosion occurred and hadn't found out about it yet, or he was the perpetrator himself. In fact, it's this uncertainty that kept police from immediately pinning the crime onto Robert, because there was still hope that he would see the news and rush back to his house. After all, he was described by his father-in-law as the best husband you could ever ask for, and was always looked upon as someone who would do anything in the name of protecting his family. So the notion that he had not only abandoned, but also done something so heinous in nature was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet one that unfortunately aligned all too well with the bleak reality of the situation. Because ever since that fateful day, Robert never came back home. The last verified sighting of Robert was captured by one of the ATM cameras at a branch of Bank One, located about half a mile south from his house. He gets there at around 10:42 in the evening. But as soon as he walks out of the car, one thing becomes apparent. And if you thought the car he just parked looked familiar, you'd be correct. Because that Toyota SUV is the same exact model as the one missing back home, which, as we've established, belonged to Mary. While at the ATM, he can be seen carrying out some form of transaction, after which he walks right back to Mary's car. The transaction turned out to be a withdrawal of exactly $280, with that maxing out all he could take out for the day. Although it's worth mentioning that if he really wanted to, he could have probably got around that limitation by utilizing some of his other accounts, which he had plenty of. But for now, let's go back to earlier that day, when Robert had just left his work. He stepped out at around 3:51, which based on a coworker was uncommon, as they always waited 2 or 3 more minutes to get credit for the whole hour. It's a tiny detail, sure, but it could be hinting toward the fact that Robert had already made up his mind on the killings, so those hours no longer served any purpose to him. Right after work, he went to see his daughter at the Supai Middle School. It was a big day for her, as all her efforts were finally being recognized by her school. And Robert was very vocal about that, as he didn't hesitate to tell his coworkers just how proud he was of Brittany's accomplishments. Though, on the contrary, Brittany's teachers had an entirely different read on him, with one of them stating that her father was there, but not there. I couldn't put my finger on it last night, but he did not seem proud of Brittany. An opinion that seems to have emerged after she congratulated Robert, expecting some kind of uplifting response, but he remained unfazed, offering but a shrug, followed by, "It's to be expected." Brittany's teachers also pointed out that they didn't see Mary anywhere in the audience, despite the fact that until then, she had been present in most of her daughter's activities. This time, however, Mary had found herself busy with her son. She sent him to the local Baptist church in order to partake in a class related to hunting safety. He was being educated on bow hunting and firearms, eager to one day put that knowledge to use alongside his father. Speaking of whom, 2 miles away from them, Robert was still with Brittany at the Supai Middle School. They wouldn't be there for long though, since they decided to leave half an hour early at around 7:35. 20 minutes later, both of them stopped at an outdoor shop called Popular Outdoor Outfitters, a store that's long gone out of business. His purchases included a water filter, an insulated water bottle, waterproof matches, and for good measure, 2 packages of water purification tablets, adding up to a total of $89.48. The cashier later stated that Robert looked like he was gearing up to leave town, as indicated by not only his purchases, but also because he had expressed concerns about waterborne viruses. One thing to remark about this encounter though is that on the official police report, it's said to have happened at 15:58 or 3:58, when the receipt itself clearly states that the purchases were made at 7:55. This was more than likely a mistake, and whoever was in charge of the case had accidentally mistaken the cashier's ID for the time. Shortly after, Robert visited the auto supply shop next door, but unfortunately, the details for this one are a little muddy. The only newspaper report that mentions it only vaguely states that he arrived at roughly the same time, a window that could mean anywhere from a few minutes to half an hour. It also doesn't help that the store's spokesman was unwilling to discuss Robert's transactions publicly. However, at some point, it seems they did provide at least some of that information to police. It's a single receipt from 3 days before the explosion, which leads me to believe he didn't buy anything on the evening of the 9th. The transactions were made at 10 in the morning, and they included 5 quarts of oil, a gallon of antifreeze, and 2 oil filters, adding up to a total of $52.39, all of which were purchased using the same credit card used at the previous store. The hunting course Mary and her son took ended at roughly 9:30. And only 30 minutes later, a neighbor reportedly heard Mary and Robert arguing with each other, which up until recently was believed to have served as the catalyst to the murders. The media has also portrayed the ATM to have been the last place Robert visited, which would put him at an over 10-hour head start on police. However, that is flat out wrong, because there's a key witness on the publicly available police reports whom they never even talked about. And that's a problem, because that witness is so crucial to the story that their statement alone disproves multiple claims made about Robert's escape. His name was Bud Wolf, a newspaper delivery guy who at 5:30 stopped by their neighborhood to do his routine delivery. But while dropping the newspapers, he mistakenly left one at Robert's house as well, which he retrieved shortly after. While he was there, he recalled that a pickup truck was obstructing the sidewalk, while a white vehicle was in front of it, under the carport. And in hindsight, he also recognized that the pickup was the same vehicle as the one seen after the explosion. Assuming that the white SUV was simply Mary's silver Toyota, which he probably misremembered, we can confidently say that when Bud stopped by his house, Robert was likely still inside. And that's a huge revelation, because it proves that, contrary to popular belief, Robert came home that night. This narrows down his escape window to just over 3 hours, a stark contrast to the initial 10. Though we aren't done here yet. As unearthed by a 2024 podcast called Missing in Arizona, police had reportedly skipped a few neighbors during their questioning process, one of whom had witnessed something unusual going on but was never given a chance to speak about it. His account of the situation was brief, but not without significance, and it went as follows. It was 3:30. Robert's neighbor had just woken up for work. He steps out and sees that both cars are present at the Fisher's house. Now here is where it gets confusing, especially when we pair that with a statement from the delivery guy. The neighbor claims to have seen Robert's pickup in the carport, whereas Bud claims it was an SUV. These observations clash with each other, and the only way it would make any sense at all would be if sometime between 3:30 and 5:30 a.m., Robert moved his pickup out of the carport and parked Mary's SUV there instead. Then after 5:30, he put his pickup back into the carport, took Mary's SUV, and immediately fled the area. Going off the assumption that these observations are accurate, it's certainly a strange thing to have occurred. Especially because Mary's car was a two-wheel drive vehicle, while Robert's was a much more capable four-wheel drive. And yet he switched them, not once but twice, and took off with the technically inferior alternative. It's hard to say why he would have done that, but my best guess is that he thought the bodies would be so indistinguishable from one another that he'd be able to frame Mary for the murders. Whether that was actually the case though, we'll never know for sure. What we do know, however, is that the trail, as sparse as it is, doesn't end there. Greg was on his way home when he noticed that a storm was approaching. The weather hadn't been too pleasant as of late, so he figured he'd stop by a familiar area and get a campfire going before it was too dark to do so. As he was looking for firewood, he came across a vehicle. He could only see a part of it though, as the rest was obscured by trees. The passenger door had been left open, yet there was no sign of a campfire or people nearby. So clearly, whoever had been there wasn't there camping. He had an inkling that it may have belonged to this guy he had just read about in a newspaper, but he couldn't be too sure. It was getting late anyway, so he turned back to his van and settled in for the night. The next morning, he put on his binoculars and checked if the car he had seen the night prior was still there. And to his surprise, it was. Except two things were now different. The passenger door, which he was so sure was open the night prior, was now closed, whereas the back window, which was previously closed, was now open. He took his time analyzing the Toyota and realized that everything he had read about Robert's vehicle mirrored his observations. There wasn't anyone around this morning either, but upon taking a closer look, he did see some movement. It was the family dog, Blue, running frantically around the Toyota, a sight that instantly set off all of Greg's alarms, prompting him to seek help urgently. He walked to the closest telephone booth and told a friend of his to call the police for him, which, based on his own reenactment of it, went something like this.
Hey, dickhead, how you doing? Yeah, whatever, Jim. I said, I think I found that Robert Fisher's car. And write this down. Give him the Forest Service road. And it had a dog. The dog is this yada yada kind of dog. It's a 4Runner. Call that in for me.
His friend later alerted the law enforcement, and Greg left the area because he didn't want to get in trouble with police, which he claims wasn't for any reason related to the case, and that it was as trivial as him being paranoid of police because he had a stash of weed in his van. Upon arriving, they were immediately greeted by Bloom, who was lying in fear under Mary's SUV. His nose was filled with porcupine needles, which were abundant inside the car as well, because all 4 doors were unlocked and all windows open. Yet the interior looked surprisingly clean, with but a handful of trivial everyday items lying around. Among them, however, was a black baseball cap, the very same one Robert had worn to the ATM, though that's where we reach a dead end in terms of items, as nothing else they recovered gets us even remotely closer to finding him. The next thing they checked for was fingerprints, of which they found a total of 9, including both the interior and exterior of the vehicle. 2 of the bunch were found in a metallic coffee cup and belonged to Robert, while the rest of them were taken from windows and to this day remain unidentified. The vehicle was conveniently left at an area that houses myriads of caves in its vicinity, each one a labyrinth in its own right, making the search a frustrating feat even for the SWAT team. The morning that followed, around 100 police officers found themselves sitting next to a cave, locally known as the 41 Club. It was a seemingly promising start, because right by the entrance of it, they had discovered a couple of fresh footprints, possibly belonging to Robert. The SWAT team believed they had him cornered, so they threw tear gas and used a sewer camera to search for him. But 8 hours later, they came back defeated, forced to stomach the fact that their efforts had been in vain, as they found no sign of Robert inside. It perhaps was a bad omen, because dead ends followed them for the rest of the day, and it only got worse by night, as the lingering storm made its way to the manhunt. Snow began pouring in, followed by a dense fog which greatly diminished the visibility. The storm had a cascading effect on the search crew as well, which had to be downscaled to just 25 people, who spent the better part of the day tracing some previously found footprints. In the end, those led to a Native American tribal land, though it seems that police didn't bother to look any further into it, and surmised they belonged to someone looking for elk antlers. At this point, the police were physically and mentally exhausted. Their operational capabilities had been wearing thin for a while. The SWAT team had long since left them, with no interest in coming back. And thanks to the weather conditions, their progress had plummeted. There was very little incentive to keep going, so as inconclusive as it was, that would mark the third and final day of the manhunt. The sheriff's office did, however, have plans for a more extensive search in the future, but sadly, that never came to fruition. The search itself was far from perfect. It covered a 1.5-mile surface radius, yet their efforts were largely centered around that single cave, which apparently wasn't even searched in its entirety. The Fort Apache tribal land wasn't checked either, despite it being less than a mile away from the vehicle, not to mention the footsteps, which went straight through that area. As a result, we're not left with much to chew on regarding his whereabouts. However, there's still one person whom I haven't yet talked about that may be of importance to the story. Very little is known about him, and details surrounding him remain largely anecdotal. But if they are to be trusted, he's known as the Hermit. He's an old guy with a heart condition who used to have a normal job working for Motorola. However, 8 years ago, he got fed up with society and decided to cut all ties with the outside world, to live tucked away in a remote area. He and 4 other people stayed there all year round, only venturing into town when absolutely necessary, mainly for food or heart medications. It's the kind of lifestyle Robert really resonated with, so it's no surprise they spent a lot of time together. The Hermit had eventually even invited him to his camp, where they bonded over their shared love for hunting. Robert had only told a coworker and his hunting buddy about the Hermit, and both of them stated that Robert seemed to be intrigued by him. As it stands, there isn't any reason to believe that Robert had an accomplice, but if he did, the Hermit would have made for the perfect candidate. Living in the woods, it's unlikely he follows the news too closely, so it's entirely possible for him to have helped Robert without even being aware that he had just killed his entire family. However, as is the case for Robert, police were never able to pinpoint the Hermit's exact location. Yet another dead end. A word that's beginning to feel synonymous with this case. One that seems to be perpetually trapped in a deep well of unanswered questions. Robert was soon added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, which undoubtedly exposed the case to the eyes of millions more people nationwide. It's a nightmare for a criminal, because 93% of all fugitives featured on that list have been caught. The media coverage and the list itself accomplished their job to some extent, as there were no lack of people claiming they saw Robert in one place or another. However, according to the FBI's description, there's a few details that distinguish him from the rest. For starters, he had a surgical scar on his lower back, which was the result of an injury he sustained while he was a firefighter, along with a visible gold crown on his upper left bicuspid tooth, which meant that given his generic appearance, finding a lookalike would be doable. But finding someone who fits that specific description and resembles Robert on top of that would be next to impossible. And yet, against all odds, it ended up happening. In 2004, a Canadian man was browsing through the FBI website when he randomly stumbled across Robert's wanted poster. That's when it dawned on him. He knew someone that looked uncannily similar to Robert, and it was none other than his neighbor's boyfriend. He didn't hesitate to send a tip to the FBI, and shortly after, over 35 police officers parked outside his neighbor's residence. Upon entering, they found a woman believed to be his girlfriend, along with the suspect, who tried to get away by going out the back door, which made police all the more certain that they had caught the right guy. To say that he simply resembled Fisher would be an understatement, because this man looked almost identical to him. Every detail, from his hair and eye color down to the tiniest of features, seemed to match perfectly. Both were 6 feet tall, similar in weight, and had previously served in the military, with only a 2-year age difference. And that's without even mentioning the more startling parallels. As we know, there are 2 attributes that set Robert apart from a lookalike, with the surgical back scar being one of them. And little do you know, the suspect had it as well, which in and of itself is somewhat uncommon, as surgery is only mandatory in 10% of all patients with back problems. Though the bizarrety of the situation doesn't even end there, as the suspect also partially matched Robert's other defining feature. I say partially because unlike Robert, he didn't have any dental crowns, albeit he did have a missing tooth in the same exact spot Robert had his gold crown. And to make things even more bizarre, police also ran into problems when identifying the suspect, a picture of whom was shown to his stepmother, who claimed he wasn't her stepson. However, she later took it back and admitted that he was. Moreover, he had also gone missing for over 10 years in the past, fueling speculation that the suspect could have been Robert's second identity. A theory born after he had told his neighbor that he had lived in the US prior to Canada. As unlikely as it seems, this kind of scenario wouldn't be a first. Better known as identity ghosting is the kind of identity theft that relies on taking the name of a dead person. One of the first publications that covered it was The Paper Trip, which used to be the go-to pamphlet when it came to changing your identity. The methods described in that particular booklet have now become obsolete, yet at the time they were considered to be exceedingly successful by the author, who went on to publish 4 follow-up installments of it, with the latest being as recently as 2024. The pamphlet abets the notion of living life as a different person. Say you weren't content with your old identity. You made a string of horrible decisions that led you down a dark path, hurting the ones closest to you, and in doing so, making your own life a living hell. Regret it or not, what's done is done. The damage is irreversible, and all that's left of it is the pain you'll have to bear for the rest of your life, as you slowly suffocate in a sea that's flooded with your own mistakes. But soon you realize that maybe not all hope is lost, that there is a way to leave the past behind and start life from scratch. Be anybody you wish to become. This is your get out of jail free card. Simply making a fictional identity though wouldn't cut it, since you're not listed on the government records. And once police ultimately ask about it, you're left with your back against the wall. So you'd have to go a step further and take someone else's identity instead. The victim would have to be of the same sex, same race, and be of similar age as you. However, if that individual is alive, you'd have to copy an existing ID. Not ideal, since they could discover what you're up to and put a stop to your new life before you even get a chance to live it. Their sole existence would cause a plethora of problems. So for the last and most essential requirement, the person must be dead. Little does the way they died matter, but finding someone whose death was forgotten over time would be the best case scenario. Which is why a child who has died at an early age would make for the perfect target. Extra points if they were in an accident where their entire family died. a tragic event which would provide the criminal with the golden opportunity to steal the child's identity. They do so by first obtaining the birth certificate of the deceased. Generally, this would be the most essential and difficult part, because once you have that, everything else, from a passport to a driver's license, can be easily obtained. The likelihood that Robert Fisher was involved in identity ghosting has never been ruled out, but whatever the case may have been, it hardly matters anymore, as the suspect was let go by the authorities, who relied on one final, determining feature: the fingerprints. Unlike DNA analysis, which give a statistical probability of a match, fingerprints are very clear-cut. They either match or they don't. There is no middle ground. And aside from everyone wanting to put an end to this case, Robert's fingerprints simply didn't match the suspect's. Obviously, fingerprint alteration isn't unheard of, and it's been going on for almost a century. Skin transplantation, abrading, cutting and burns are the main ways of doing that. However, there was no sign of those present on the suspect's fingerprints, which put an end to that chapter once and for all. The signs were always there, but some were certainly more visible than others. Robert was leaving for work when he encountered a stray pit bull right outside his house. At the time, he used to have a black Labrador named Roger, and according to his narrative, Roger jumped in on the stray dog to protect the family, and that's when the fight ensued. Robert felt compelled to act quickly, so he grabbed a pistol, pointed it at the stray dog, and without thinking twice, pulled the trigger. The pit bull staggered away, leaving a 300-foot blood trail before an animal control officer got a hold of it. The stray was brought to a nearby veterinary clinic, where it was reported to have been in a stable condition, though unfortunately, it couldn't pull through in the end. If the dog had an owner, Robert intended to pay for it, but other than that, he didn't show much remorse, because to him, what he did wasn't the product of a lack of judgment. It was a rather deliberate act done to protect others. Or so he claimed. Police say the scenario had been orchestrated to fit his narrative. The animals didn't simply start fighting out of the blue, nor did the Labrador jump in to protect the family. That's merely the story Robert made up, because he knew that if the truth came out, he'd be rotting in a jail cell. The fight between the animals was induced by Robert himself. That way, he could use the attack along with the bruises in his dog as a justification to kill the pit bull. He was certainly trigger happy, as a friend of his described him. It wasn't uncommon for him to randomly begin firing a gun into the air, which he did when hunting, or pointing a loaded gun at his friend's head, which is something his disturbed mind saw as a perfectly normal, run-of-the-mill joke. It's hard to pinpoint at what exactly led to this unhinged behavior, which no amount of explanation could ever justify, because undeniably, the train for that has long since left the station. Though I'd be remiss if I said that none of it stems from his past, because that wouldn't be entirely true either. He was around 14 years old when his parents divorced, an event that, unbeknownst to him at the time, would plague him for the rest of his life. He never got too attached to his family, out of fear of getting too close to people and losing them, much like he lost his parents. He also refused to take his children to Disneyland, as that would give him flashbacks of the last time his parents had a screaming fight, and divorce itself became the one thing to avoid at all costs, even if it meant taking his own life to prevent it. Robert was vocal about never wanting to face the reality where his family was falling apart. He grew bitter of his parents, and especially his dad, who abused alcohol, so he wanted to become the opposite of him, which with some things such as avoiding alcohol he did, but others ultimately slipped through the cracks and stuck with him, even during his marriage. The control he demanded from his family was one of them. He'd tell his kids when to get up, when to fall asleep, what clothes to wear, what to eat, the list goes on. Mary's mother gave her homemade quilts on occasion, but Mary had to keep them in a closet because Robert had demanded her to. He and his wife often fought about their marriage, money, sexual life, you name it. It was anything but a happy relationship. And although most fights weren't physical in nature, the verbal abuse was probably just as challenging to endure. But his abusive behavior didn't stop there. It slithered away toward the people he pretended to care about most. His children. A while back, Robert used to own a boat, which he used for fishing, a pastime that predated his passion for hunting. However, he didn't see that same passion he had for the outdoors in his children, which made him steadily grow more and more frustrated at them. Eventually, he brought them along on a fishing trip and decided it was finally time to teach them a lesson. He did so by grabbing both of them and dropping them out of the boat. Needless to say, they were horrified. Their loud cries quickly filled the air as they found themselves hovering on a thin line between life and death. It would have been a very traumatic experience for a child their age, enough so to completely shift the perception they once had of their father. He eventually pulled them back up, only to follow with, "Now there, how's that?" being oblivious to the fact that if anything, it had made the problem much worse, while simultaneously leaving his children with as much hatred for him as he had for his dad growing up. His relationship with Mary wasn't getting any better either. 3 years ago, she had learned that Robert had an affair with a coworker, and as a result, she had kicked him out of the house. Robert spent his time isolated in the mountains, where he gave Mary an ultimatum. Either she came to meet him there, or he would commit suicide. However, neither of those things ended up happening, because Robert came on his own a couple days later. Their marriage was left on shaky ground ever since, and never truly recovered from it, especially because in the months prior to the tragedy, Robert had got himself in yet another affair, from which he had acquired a urinary tract infection. During that time, he was consumed by paranoia, as he feared people would check his medical records and tell the truth to his wife. He became increasingly isolated, stopped reaching out to many of his close friends, and even something as simple as trying to have a conversation with him became a challenge in and of itself. He probably felt the walls closing in on him as the end of his marriage loomed on the horizon. But to Robert, divorce was never an option. So in his twisted mind, there was only one way out of it. Only one way to ensure that Mary wouldn't file for divorce. And that was by killing her.
He killed his wife and kids 10 years ago and then vanished in the woods.
2 decades later. At the time of writing this, he would be 63 years old. Admittedly, things have slowed down a lot, and as much as I hate to say it, we have yet to make any meaningful progress toward finding him. It's plausible that he ended his own life shortly after the killings. However, statistics suggest that in most family-side cases, the perpetrator takes their life at the scene of the murder. So, if Robert had driven miles away to do so, that would certainly be considered unusual. The items he purchased the day before the explosion tell a different story as well. It seemed that survival was his main priority, and his sole intent was to take care of the problem and move on with a new life. Whether he managed to do that, though, remains a mystery. The depressing reality is that most family annihilators fly under the radar. They take the form of loving husbands and great fathers on the surface, oftentimes have no criminal record, and for all intents and purposes blend in as valuable members of society. They see themselves as the head of their family, and hence their entire sense of self-worth is linked to their ability to control their family members. For as long as they maintain that control, everything is fine. But once they lose their grasp of it, that's when things begin to unravel. The trigger is usually the potential loss of something significant to them. That could be their job, their children, or in Robert's case, their wife. It's at this point when their facade crumbles and their true colors are exposed. Disillusioned by hopelessness, they believe that their family is better off dead than alive, and they turn to murder as the only means of regaining the control they once had. If you made it up to this point, I want to thank you personally for joining me throughout this journey. This video has been a long time in the making, so any kind of support would be greatly appreciated. And with that said, I'll see you guys in the next one.